सभी को नमस्कार. Today I welcome to all of you for this our second session of our Heritage Studies course. And directly I request to Sindhuji for to start our this today's session.
Sure, sir. Namaskar to all of you. I shall start by sharing my presentation. सर आपको दिखाई दे रहा है?
Yes, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. Conservation in India. Yes.
Yes, sir. One second. Okay, so today let's start with the second session, conservation in India. I have broadly divided the entire session into two parts, concepts and principles which were in practice in ancient times. And then the part two focuses on conservation laws, rules, regulations, and practices during the British times and also the present day. Now, as we discuss the course structure, we will start with a quick recap. In yesterday's session, we looked at what is heritage and its importance. We identified and understood what is tangible and intangible heritage, and also two very important aspects of values and significance. We identified a couple of values which we can associate with the heritage. And also, we try to understand with two case studies the importance of values and significance, how they could reflect on the decision taken forward for conservation process. The first one was Historic Center of Warsaw, which was in Poland, where value was symbolic, intangible, and associative. Significance was their inner strength and determination of the citizens or the people of the place. And the conservation approach that they took was almost total reconstruction with a little bit of restoration and restoration, actually. And what did they actually achieve by this? Architectural form was manifestation of care and attention taken to ensure the survival of the most important testimonials of Polish culture. If at all, if they went ahead with any other alternative, method, instead of reconstructing exactly the same thing what it was, then probably they would have lost this Polish culture which they had. So I guess reconstruction was a good approach. And on the other hand, we looked at Coventry Cathedral in UK, where symbolic and commemorative historical values were identified, and significance, a moving reminder of folly and what a waste of war, and also a quest for peace and reconciliation. So for both, their approach was slightly different. They retained the ruins of old cathedral. They preserved it as a memorial or as a sacred space for the city. And then for the future generation to look forward, they constructed a new cathedral. So they preserved the old and constructed the new, which was in contemporary style. So these are some of the things that we learned in yesterday's session. In today's session, we look at, very quickly how the conservation in India happened from the past to the current. Conservation in India actually never really waited for crisis, to happen in olden days. If we go back to epic days, we remember, ashrams and hermitages which were allotted to Brahmins in the forest areas. They strictly prohibited killing of animals. And their minimalistic lifestyle kind of ensured that they lived in harmony with the natural environment. The forest, flora, fauna, everything was kind of protected. And coming back to the concept of Jeernoddhar, dharana which existed during that time, we know that India has inherited enormous wealth of rich natural and cultural heritage. Uh, the architectural heritage, very significant proportion of them are living monuments. So one such, couple of such monuments also fall under temple. Now, temple is considered not as just the home of God, but the form of God in terms of its structure, as realized as the body and the space contained within it as the spirit. The Skandopashanid, the notes actually says, Devo Devalaya Prakriti Jivana Devas Sanatana. That means the body is like a alaya or a dwelling place, and the jiva which dwells within that body is the supreme being, the soul or the spirit. So they celebrated the spirit when they say Jirnodharana. It meant not just the body, but also the spirit which lives in that intangible aspect was also to be protected and preserved. So the layout of temple or any residential building for that matter, that kind of synonymous with the layout of cosmos, like Panchabhutas. A building is a living organism. So uh, with the analogy of building to be like living organism, it is only natural that buildings age like the body ages, like we age. They wither over time, and that they need renewal and renewal of external shell, that is the body. The shell performs its function better to hold the spirit inside, which is existing inside, more efficiently when it is renewed or regenerated. So in ancient building tradition, this was the concept which was practiced, that is Jirnodharana, or is a restoration or renovation or repairing whatever was in ruins. So the practice of conservation starts with that in ancient time. The spirit was the center of the activity of a building in ancient India, be it a temple or a residential building, and any building for that matter. So let's look at little later days during third century. What happened? Now, governance was the focus on clean environment and wildlife conservation in India. Now, this date backs to third century during the time of Chandragupta Maurya and also Ashoka. So, Ashoka's rule is the foremost example of ecological responsible statehood in Indians' ancient history. Chandragupta Maurya, I believe, had appointed Kupyo Daksha, means forest department head. This is, of course, got from Kautilya's Arthashastra. This is in, to make sure that an official or an administrative document spells out that wildlife conservation measures taken during his time. So the head of the forest ensured that he would protect the natural environment and the wildlife. That was his responsibility. Uh, and also, during Ashoka times, through his rock edifice, we see that banning of certain practices, and all of this are the source of all this are available in various texts, and also um, here what you can see on the right side, it's a document where uh, it is prescribed that environment has to be protected, animal cruelty or is prohibited. So that is a policy which is written so that every common man understands it and follows it. So these were the rules given to them. So on the right you also see an artistic depiction during one of the foreign visitors during the time of Buddha, where he is talking to people, and his principles were followed. And one of the most important principle was wildlife conservation. So measures that they took. In Mauryan period, one of the well-documented and well-researched periods that we all know in India today, a talented military leader and an extraordinary statesman, Ashoka, um, when he ruled between the period of 269 BC to 232 BC, post Kalinga years, that is post Kalinga Wars years. Not only did Ashoka became a philanthropic administrator, but also, he engaged in a lot of activities, adherent supporter of conservation and wildlife preservation. So what he also did was, banning of hunting animals, and he reserves established in cruelty to domestic animals and wildlife protection, or that was taken up. And one interesting thing that you see on the right is Sanchi Stupa. I believe Mauryan state also maintained empire's forest. Along with it, they cultivated fruit groves, botanical pharmacies, and herbal gardens that has been established for cultivation of medicinal herbs. So Ashoka's rule is the foremost ecological driven, or can be an example for ecological responsible conservation that had happened in the past. So during 5th century, we also have Yajnavalkya Smriti, a historic Indian text, again, where jurisprudence suggested that to have been written about prohibited and the cutting of trees, felling of trees. And they prescribed a severe punishment if such act is done. So this also shows that, how conservation was very important in those days. So let's move a little forward and see what happened in the times of Chola era. You see Rajagopala Swami temple on the right. Temples actually today, are pilgrimage or religious monuments, occasionally visited for their art and architecture, probably as a tourist. But in the past, temples were one of the socio-religious institutions where temples, tangible manifestation of society, tradition, culture, they played a huge, significant role in linking the historical past. For instance, their walls, temple walls, served as a record keepers. You might remember or recollect, when you have visited several temples, say for example, Halebeedu and Belur temples in Karnataka, they kind of exhibit the epics of Mahabharata or Ramayana, everything, kind of sculptured outside the temple wall. It was like a book, source of information for the public, for the common, to understand the importance of our culture and tradition. So that was the way they communicated to the common. In temples, we find many inscriptions, especially in Tamil Nadu temples. There's huge record of administrative and social decisions which were taken up by the authorities, at that time, by the local people or local rulers. And everything was kind of had these inscriptions either on the temples or, in the precinct, you will find a lot of stones where the inscriptions are carved, like talking about what happened and some important events that was all documented there. Now, for example, coming back to conservation, there are several inscriptions of 8th and 10th, the peak Chola period. They throw light upon lot of conservation, water conservation, management of rainwater, irrigation, tank systems, particularly, rainwater harvesting system, how to collect water. And one such, important inscription also talks about how the Brihat temple at Tanjavur was managed for conservation of water. So more than 100 inscriptions across region deal exclusively with this kind. So broadly, we have a lot of inscriptions which talk about how they managed water. Now, water is a very important source, and natural environment or the nature is managed in such a way that they conserve water. They manage the water for a lot of things. Like in Tamil Nadu, this Kaveri Delta and Tamirabarani Delta, they are the two deltas which are very, very significant. And we find a lot of inscription around this delta. Like say Tamre region inscriptions talk more about, how this area was water starved. And, they gave us astonishing data on how they manage the water here, be it for irrigation or drinking or whatever facilities. So these inscriptions, which goes back to 700 to 1000 years ago, connected to water conservation in temples and places like Mannar Koval or Pudukottai. These are some of the places where we have found a lot of inscriptions which talk about precisely about water conservation. And what you see on the right hand side here, this is a place where villagers wanted to do cultivation. At that time, the ruler who was ruling this part has written the inscription of here. The plan was like, every tank had multiple weirs always built in consonance with the local terrain to drain out the excess water. So using these, farmers irrigated the fields. The interested boatsmen, in the river and the lower estuaries and ports, they were also taken care of so that, the flooding water does not do not harm them. And enough water was, permitted them by bringing, boats up the river. So upper reaches had a higher number of larger tanks, which fed water into the smaller ones, the tanks and the ponds at the lower end. So before finally it drains out into the sea, the water is well utilized. So as a result, during floods, the limits were rarely breached. And during droughts, each tank had water. Now, why am I talking about this? Because if we don't preserve such inscriptions, we ignore them, then the knowledge system that was existing before is lost forever. We'll never know how they managed situations of drought or floods, whatever it is in those times. So this immense knowledge is all in the form of inscriptions, and they're written the temple. So temple precincts become a huge knowledge fund. So conserving or preserving those inscriptions and temples is of benefit for us. So moving ahead, during 11th and 12th century, we come across another very important, social reformer, Sri Ramanujacharya, now who propagates Bhakti movement. Traditional account says that he followed Kaveri, as far as Ramnathpuri, also known as Vahin Pushkarni. Then he proceeded to a place called Tondanuru via Saligrama, and then he reaches Melkote. So when he does this, comes down to south to Karnataka, he stays here for about 12 years in Tondanuru and in Melkote. So what does he do? For 12 years at Tondanuru, Sri Ramanujacharya does a lot of restoring activities, conservation and restoration. He is a saint and a social reformer. Of course, his main agenda was to propagate Bhakti Siddhanta, which promotes equality in front of God, like without any prejudice. But what is our interest is what he did in that 12 years apart from this. Something that is related to conservation. So there were temples here which existed before. Three important temples, Lakshmi Narayana temple and Gopal Krishna's temple, and also Yoga Narsimha temple. These three, they have been said that, Veda Purush Bhrigu Maharshi and Prahalada, from the epic times, they built these temples and they were all in ruins. So Ramanujacharya takes up the restoration of these temples. Of course, his main contribution is another intangible, heritage that we must remember at this point is that he contributes, the functions and the rituals and the maintenance of all the Vishnu temples. In fact, Sri Rangam even today, after thousands of years, follows whatever was given by Sri Ramanujacharya. From morning till evening routine and the entire annual routine of the temple, what to cook, what to perform, how to do the puja, when to start, when to close, everything. The entire doctrine or the functioning of the temple is given by him as a tradition, and that tradition has been carried forward. Even today, they practice, and hopefully they continue, and the future generation also get the advantage of it. So he was the one who introduced Pancharatha Agama systems in Karnataka, and this also motivated the Hoysala rulers down here. I won't get into those things, but the point important here is that he restores all the old ruins of temples. So the activity of conservation restoration happens during his time as well. So moving forward, during the ancient times are, as we see, they focused on natural environment, conservation of water, conservation of ecology, and all that. During the British time, also, many kings who reigned certain regions, they also focused on this. For instance, Mysore Wadiyars in 17th century, they actually saw a steady expansion of the territory during the time of Narsaraja Wadiyar actually, and also Chikkadevaraja Wadiyar. Now the kingdom annexed large expanses of what is known as South Karnataka and parts of Tamil Nadu today, to become the most powerful state in the southern Deccan region at that time. But however, the later 18th century, we all know that the ruling was shifted to Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan. They ruled the areas. Now, during this time, it came into conflict with the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad, and also the Kingdom of Travancore, Britishers, all were fighting for this land. And this kind of culminated into four Anglo-Mysore wars. We are aware of Anglo-Mysore wars from the history, that the first Anglo-Mysore war and the stalemate of the second was followed by defeat in the third and fourth. So eventually British take over the power and they restore Wadiyars. And Wadiyars were great rulers. They kind of transformed the princely state, and this they did continue to rule until India became independent in 1947, and Mysore acceded to the Union of India. Now, Mysore emerges as one of the important centers of art and culture. Now, the relevance is of two important peoples here. VP Madhavarao, who focused on conservation of forest, founded the Legislative Council in 1907. He created second chamber, which precisely took measures for forest conservation. He was Diwan of Mysore from 1906 to 1909, and then Baroda from 1910 to 1913. Now we look at another important, legendary person. We all celebrate Engineers Day in his name. An excellent statesman and eminent engineer, Sir M. Vishwesvaraya. Now he became Diwan in 1912, and he's also called as maker of modern Mysore. Now, important point here is he worked towards conservation in a very, very different way, in a very advanced way. We all know that, in the Mysore region, he's the architect of Krishnaraja Sagar Dam, KRS or Vrindavan Gardens. That is very relevant today. We all go as tourists to appreciate this project. Now, one of the biggest dams in India, and this irrigated hundreds and thousands of acres of land. In fact, the most important change that it brought was the Mandya district, which was very close to Mysore district, was very barren. So it converted this barren Mandya district into a rice granary, provides drinking water to Mysore and also to Bangalore even today. So he implemented irrigation system in Karnataka. Now that is a huge step forward for conserving water, which otherwise would have gone wasted. And also, Bhadravati Iron and Steel Works, as a chairman to this, he rescued it from being extinct. Again, he restored Bhadravati Iron Works. But let's look at in planning of Hyderabad city. Actually, very interesting. There's a tech talk by Anuradha, and most of it is information from that TED talk, which is very very interesting. Um, in 1591, Hyderabad was a very planned city, double graded layout, and it grew around the Charminar as we see today. But going back to 1912, Nawab Samir Osman Ali Khan, he was the controversial new Nawab. But he became the Nizam in the troubled times. It had undergone two calamities. 1908 floods claimed 50,000 lives and 10,000 homes. And this was followed by 1911 epidemic, a plague which claimed even more lives, like 100,000 lives. So then what they did, Nizam calls or he invites Sir MV in the 1909. He asks him to find solution for this problem of floods. And also he forms city improvement board. Sir MV was called to address these floods, and he gives a wonderful solution to this. Actually, what you see here is a reservoir. Now he masterminds the entire water management in this city. He proposes two dams, Himayat Sagar and Osman Sagar reservoirs. He masterminds the entire city plan along with it. I'll just go back to the same slide. Here again, the focus is on water conservation. What CRMV shows is the way water can be conserved and managed for the benefit of mankind, which otherwise would have been more destructive, by causing floods and all that. So it not only controls the flooding, but also assists in irrigation to a scale that the state never really saw before. So this further, Nawab formed this city improvement board, where again, important point here is SRMV also proposes tree-aligned boulevards. Now, boulevards and lot of lung spaces for the city. Again, a method of conserving green and allowing the water to percolate into the earth or ground. So, a lot of lung spaces that was planned together with the residential areas or other buildings. Another thing is, what they do also is along the river Musi, they decide to build public buildings instead of residential. While doing so, they're achieving two things. One is even when flood happens, the lives are not lost because it is no more residential place. And public buildings per se denotes the heart of the city or the center of the city, and they kind of dictate the planning. So we'll see a couple of architectural examples here. All of these buildings were conceived during that time. And here, many architects, planners, engineers, horticulturists, and even botanists, they were all sent to Europe to understand how their how their municipality worked, and so that they could bring back what is applicable to Hyderabad. So some of it were like recycling techniques, letting storm water into the river very cautiously. So heritage preservation, reusing the old buildings were one of the important things that they got back. And apparently this reduces the carbon footprint. So which is of the discussion today. So that conservation and heritage preservation, they did it 100 years ago when you see that. And also when we come back to these buildings, the architecture of the buildings, was to represent communal harmony and social coherence. So for instance, architectural elements were, taken from Kakatiyan lintels or brackets from temples. And also these were combined with, Qutub Shahi domes, gateways from Bidar, colonnades from Gulbarga. So architectural elements were drawn from various, cultural traditions and kind of adapted into these buildings so as to show the secular nature, the cosmopolitan nature of the city. This was well depicted by the most visual form of all arts, that is through architecture of these buildings. So these are the tangible heritage, perhaps, that we need to conserve now. So let's look at one more important, attempts down south by Bellavi Venkataramanappa. He his restoring the ruins is exceptional work. He was a tall thin man. The physic was his concerned passion to preserve the past of the city stands even more taller. So it is not just one temple in Baswangudi, South Bangalore, but lot of other heritage landmarks like Bugle Rock Park, temples in and around the Rock Garden, Kannada Sahitya Parishad building, Baswangudi Union and Service Club that was there. So all of these iconic structures actually owe their existence even today to this untiring efforts of Venkataramanappa. I'll tell you a very interesting story, that goes with him. He wanted to, build a Shiva temple actually in this region. But he finds this Mallikarjuna Swami temple, behind Bull Temple in the Bugle Rock Park in Bengaluru. This is a classic example that one can quote, showing his efforts to restoring the ruin. In 1900s, actually, these new extensions like Chamrajpet, Baswangudi, and Malleshwaram, the very important, culturally rich neighborhood of Bangalore even today. This was formed in 1900s to decongest the old Bangalore area. So due to the existence of Bull Temple and the rock garden and lot of greenery and scenic atmosphere, you see the temple and the lake in front, it was very beautiful, very scenic. So this place kind of attracted a lot of intellectuals to come and settle over here. So he also comes and settles down here. The temple, the Mallikarjuna temple, actually was built by the kings of Mysore, when Achyutaraya was ruling somewhere in 17th century. So, but after the Third Anglo War, Bangalore in 1791, this place was deserted, and along with it, even this temple was deserted. So that stayed in ruins. So when he comes back and settles, that's the house which is existing even today in the neighborhood. You can see that. Like I said, a lot of intellectual bureaucrats and other legal luminaries come and settle over here. Venkataramanappa actually, like I said, he wanted to build that Shiva temple, and he finds this. What he does is he tries to hold on to it and restore it. The restoration activity, he was involved so much so that, he was going there. In fact, he used to stand amidst the constructor, and also even laid bricks and plaster and, in the whole process of restoring this temple, actually. He was very, very interested in restoration. To what extent, an interesting story comes here, that we just discussed VP Madhav Rao as Diwan, right? He comes to Bangalore. Actually, Venkataramanappa invites him, and when he invites, after the completion of this restoration of this temple, he invites Madhav Rao, and when he comes, he decks up the entire path of the main road which goes to the temple. He decorates it, and traditionally welcomes with lot of Veda mantras and scholars around. And Diwan is very surprised for this celebration. So then he asks, what is this? Why all this? Then he's so with such a humility, he says that I had taken an oath that I would offer 1,000 lights to Lord Shiva and distribute sweets when the new Diwan assumes the office. Now the time has come, and I'm trying to fulfill it. Now you can read what is behind his intention. Like, the passion is realized by the divan, and he asks what is it that he needs. So this is where the most important point comes, when Venkataramanappa actually says that the temple is belongs to the government, it belongs to the people, and that has to be protected. Till now, I have protected, I have restored it, and I'm so keen on the government taking up it as a responsibility for its protection in future, and I want that from you. The point here to be noted is that yes, we are all interested in conserving buildings. We do that also. But what next? We should also ensure that it is left in right hands, and the preservation or conservation continues. It's a continuous process, right? It has to continue, and therefore that is given to the next generation, and they also enjoy the property or the richness of the heritage. So you did. So this is an example. In fact, he stands as a role model, for the present generation, as a reminder that it is their primary duty to preserve history, culture, and monument, in which is at least there in the residential area. So here we kind of conclude the first part. We saw the conservation concepts and ideas that was followed by individuals, kings, rulers in the past. Let's quickly look at what the conservation during British times and also post-British times. Now, these are antiquarian laws. The government of India is the various state governments, they have framed many acts and rules for the protection, preservation, and proper management of cultural and natural heritages of our nation. Now, the Constitution itself of India prescribes under the fundamental duties that the protection of heritage is one of the important duties of each citizen of India, and that they are responsible, they are the custodians to take care of this. And also Article 49, which says the protect which highlights the protection of every monument and place, which is all under the act, which all falls under the act, that that has to be taken care, which is of national importance. So let's try and understand a few things about legislation. As a background, I would like to bring in light few things. Back in 18th century, when the British were ruling, many of these British officers and many individuals, they began to ship away the enormous antiquarian wealth of India. Now, there was no control over this vandalism. Realizing this immeasurable and irreplaceable loss of cultural heritage of India, few enlightened administrators, luckily, began to realize that there is a need for enactment which can safeguard the material culture of heritage of India, and that they are not exported and they're not sent off from the land where they belong to. So, as a result, the first act, Bengal Regulation Act in the 1810, was passed. Now, this was the first act attempt to protect the antiquarian wealth of India. Now, this was followed by Madras Regulation Act in 1817. So, further in 1840, there was also a directive from the East India Company itself that they had to return the temples back to those trustees, because they felt the Christian missionaries in India and also in abroad, they could not, or rather, they did not like the idea of Christians managing the Hindu temples. So they gave it back to the custodians of temples here in India. But however, this 1814 Act does not really focus on if the buildings were under private ownership. So now here is where another act comes into picture, 1863, where this act actually empowers the government to prevent injury to any of the protected buildings, which is of remarkable, antiquity and historical and architectural value, whether it falls under government or private, that has to be protected. But again, the most important act which did reasonably well in holding on to the treasure is Indian Treasure Trove Act in 1878. Now, this was promulgated to protect and preserve treasure which was found accidentally Like, if you are a farmer and you're digging up your land and you find something which you realize is of ancient times and of value, and also the archaeological or historical value, then what do you do with that? So this act was enacted to protect such treasures under so that they are lawfully disposed or given to the government. Now, this also is this act also gave an interpretation clause where they said who is the treasurer, or what is a treasure, and the collector. Now, treasure means anything that is of value which is hidden in the soil. Like I said, when you're tilling the soil, you find something, or anything of its like that is all the treasure. And collector means any revenue officer who is independent in charge of the district. Either he becomes a collector, or an officer who is appointed by the government to perform the functions of collector under this act. They probably identified a specific officer, and if the region demanded it. So this act actually was very, very significant. The Indian Treasure Trove Act of 1878. Then we have Ancient Monument Preservation Act of 1904. Here, the cultural heritage of the new era was to be protected. Like this act provided efficient preservation and authority over the monument, particularly which were under the custody of individual or private ownership. Now, this is very important, which was neglected earlier. Now, this focuses on the ownership of the cultural heritage. So, in this act, this act actually kind of abolishes the early act that we have that was in force. So, and this act provides guidance and rules under three major aspects. That is ancient monuments, traffic in antiquities, and also archaeological excavation. So, following this, the next act was the Antiquities Export Control Act in 1947. Now, here they provided the regulation over the export of antiquities, that under a license issued by the Director General. So he was empowered, and he could decide whether any article was of such an importance, or whether it is not an antiquity if they had to export it. So the purpose of the act and his decision was final, so that they tried to avoid trafficking, and much of the heritage, material heritage at least, was secured or safeguarded. So after this, another important acts come, the Ancient and Historical Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains. This was a national, this act actually, came in as a declaration of national importance. Along with it was 1951 State Regulation Act. Now, here, all the ancient and historical monuments and also archaeological sites and their remains, they were all earlier protected by, the Ancient Monument Preservation Act of 1904. But these which were identified under that act were all now redeclared as monuments of national importance. So, which meant that the importance of this act was to identify and enlist all the important monuments and sites under the national importance. So, this was also supported by the State Reorganization Act, that is in 1956. So this, in order to bring the act on par with constitutional provisions, and for providing better and effective preservation of archaeological wealth of the country. So they came up with another act in 1958. This act actually abolished the act before, that is 1951. Now here, they not only claim the national important sites, but also for the regulation of the archaeological excavation. So this act, under this act, people could get the permission to dig up the archaeological sites and protect the sculptures, carvings, and such like items. So subsequently, this also abolished 1951 Act. So the next is Antiquities and Art Treasure Acts, which came in 1972. This is very similar to the Antiquities Act, the Export Control Act, which happened in 1947. So this kind of abolishes that act. Here, it was taken care that for more effective control over the movable cultural property consisting of antiquities and art treasures. So to secure and safeguard. So the next was an act, the recent act, um, the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains, that is AMSAR Act of 2010. This was revised. So provision here was to consider validation of certain actions taken by the central government under the said act. So central government could exercise their acts and actions in the protection and conserving of these monuments and archaeological sites. So these are some of the acts and rules. And the next comes the civic legislation. Here, again, the framework for catering to conservation is primarily through state, town, and country planning acts. Actually, the purpose of this, falls under threefold. To safeguard the environments and the protected monuments. Largely, earlier acts were focusing on the monuments, but what happens to the precinct around the monuments, the environment or the immediate, surrounding, that also needs to be safeguarded and, protected. So this act kind of accommodates that, and it also declares certain conservation areas, identifies certain conservation areas, and indicating the land use for them, and listing and protecting historic buildings and indicating their proper usage to ensure against loss of cultural continuity. So these were some of the three important actions which were taken under this legislation. So heritage in India is largely regulated and protected by this Ancient Monument and Archaeological Act. Archaeological Survey of India Act, along with this, the states having their own counterpart legislations put together, they regulate and protect monuments, whatever comes under their purview. Like in some region, it is central property, and if it is of national importance, then the central takes care of it. And if it is for the say state important, then the state takes care of it. So primarily, if you look at what do they actually do when they say conservation, they have certain important activities that they do. They list the most important, they identify and they list the heritage sites and buildings, and then they do the inventory of the building properties and documents them. And they also make the selection criterias for grading, like grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So depending on their importance, that is done. And also they decide the methodology of conservation, and they also give the guidelines for conservation. So this is the work of this. All of this is done under this act. So when these acts are there, what are the institutional setup to manage heritage management? So institutional setup, are these ULB, urban local bodies, and civic societies, and also NGOs. So they are all like inter-supportive. They work together. The urban local bodies, with their building bylaws, like CDP, like City Development Plan, which provides the details, like process of conferring certain area or designating certain area as heritage zone, or giving certain areas the heritage status. So thereby identifying the owner of the heritage maintenance, who would maintain that area, what are the rules for that zone or regulation, identified zone, to see that public and private partnerships kind of maintain these zones. So these urban local bodies play a huge role. With them, NGOs like INTAC and various other bodies which are not government organization, they also coming together to support the urban local bodies. Together, they all manage the entire conservation or heritage zones. in India. So let's have a little more insight on INTAC. The Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. This was founded in 1984. Now, this has a very important two broad roles. Like, they function as a voluntary organization. This is a non-government organization. So they are voluntary organization, and in that role they have their objectives quite fluid and variable. And as a professional organization, they define their objectives and targets very clearly. So primary being to create awareness towards conservation of cultural and natural heritage, and they have been working immensely. And under this, the voluntary organization, they do spreading the network by opening chapters. So they have chapters which are based on regional chapters. So in all major towns and cities, so we have a Bangalore chapter, Mumbai chapter, Delhi chapter, like that. They have chapters based on the areas of the regions. And then they organize a lot of seminars, they conduct workshops, they conduct exhibitions. So this is all public front and bringing a lot of awareness in people, and their own members. So they taking resource of visual media like films and all, they document the heritage zones. And under the professional organization, they do a very systematic documentation on listing of historical buildings that is there in that region. Like if it is Hassan chapter, then they go ahead and list out all the heritage monuments and precincts which are there of national importance or state importance, whatever, whether value and significance. They do that, they document that, and they list it. The moment it is listed, it is protected. There's a body to protect that. Identification of heritage conservation zones. They undertake conservation works also, laying down guidelines for urban designs, then framing training schemes for building experiences for field of conservation, then lot of administration and scholarships. In fact, I won in my undergraduation INTAC scholarship. Like I was cited, actually, not scholarship. My thesis project was cited under INTAC. And like that, they encourage and build the interest in young minds. So proposing appropriate legislation, developing close related ministries. They connect to the ministries and government and all the international organization like ICOMOS as well. So they are the people who connect people and the institutions, actually. So I am giving certain visuals over here. All of these are in the early 10 years that they managed to do, or that they kind of frameworked. Today, INTAC has really grown and doing a lot of activities, but that activities we will look ahead in other sessions. Here, let's understand the fundamentals of the organization. Like it aims to act as a visible and catalytic body with active participation of its members. So every bit, people who are interested in conservation and have some experience or knowledge can get into INTAC and work there, become their member and work through them. So they have, like I said, regional chapters, and these regional chapters, they have this structural and area conservation program where buildings are conserved, then areas are conserved, and socio-economic developmental plans are implemented, and they also work towards heritage tourism. Apart from that, they have a lot of other scopes, like they take up these activities. They train people. They have the laboratory in Lucknow and also in Delhi, and they have they're all equipped to actually do all of these restoration and repair projects in the temples and other heritage buildings. So they do those works on restoration of the paintings, textiles, wooden and metal objects. So they do this. Apart from that, they also focus on interventions against ecological incompatible dams. Like dams today, unfortunately, unlike Sir MV time, have become very commercial projects. They don't really acknowledge the ecological damage and resettlements when they do of the people who are settled in and around those identified dam area, they're very they're very casual about it. So they displace people and they don't even bother to see to that the damage is costed less. So such kind of huge projects are resisted by these intact people. They bring awareness and they bring people together to fight for such things. So this is one of the important activities they've been doing. And also they conserve a lot of natural heritage which is there in India. So this map actually shows a couple of natural heritage conservation projects that has been taken by Intact in early 10 years, somewhere in 1992. And of course, when we talk about conservation management, what does it involve? It involves a lot of these things. Like it involves fiscal measures that one needs to take up. The tourism, then punitive measures, the rules and regulations, and education, public awareness. So all of these are managed, or conservation management roles. So I think that is the conclusion of today's session. Moving ahead, let's just quickly look at the assignment. This assignment again is not compulsory, but I would really encourage all of you to attempt to it. It's a very simple question to answer. All you have to do is identify any heritage site which is protected. It could be site or a building or anything that is protected by Intact chapter of your region. So wherever you live, if you're living in a big town or a small town which has an Intact chapter, then definitely you would know like which heritage site is closer to you, which is protected by Intact. And also bring in some kind of insight on the same. How are they doing? What are they doing? What is the outcome of their chapter? So that's the assignment for today. Thank you.
So if there are any questions, then please ask, or in chat box you can write it.
Hello, good evening, ma'am.
Vikram Bharadwaj asked one question in our chat box. How we have to submit our assignment? You can send directly the assignments on my WhatsApp number, so that it's no problem. You can send the assignments on my WhatsApp, no problem. Can we get these PPTs, please? As per our institution rule, no one will get the PPTs, but you will get the entire session recording links. So it's okay. Yeah, please, Vrishaliji, please ask question.
Yeah, ma'am, what is the exact difference between conservation, restoration, and renovation?
Okay. Actually, madam, I'll be covering this part in the following session. So they're all different. So conservation, restoration is to restore something, make sure that whatever you add to the already existing part is done in such a way that the original image or the form is retained. And conservation is finding the use for it, like like the approaches that we discussed with the 2 case studies. So the one went for total reconstruction. That's an approach. So that is, they're still conserving whatever they had to, whether it is tangible or intangible heritage. So that is conservation. So they're all slightly different, and probably going forward we'll cover this in more detail.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there any other question? Then please ask. Is there anyone? Yeah, yes, please. Vrishali ji, अगर और कुछ पूछना है तो पूछ सकते हैं.
Namaste.
Yeah.
One by one, please. One by one. Yeah, any one of you, please ask. Yeah, Divya ji, please.
Namaste. Bhagini, this Intact chapter that you mentioned about, is there any website or somewhere where we can find out according to our region which are already identified? Is there a source where we can get the data from?
all you can do is just type intact, and it will show. It's an immense information available on the on their websites. So you can get into regional intact and find out what is happening. They would have listed some of the important buildings under grade 1, grade 2, and all that. So some where work is going on. So you can get the fundamental information from their websites, and you can identify your heritage in and around your neighborhood. You can do that.
Okay, धन्यवाद.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vrishali ji, please ask now.
सर झालं माझं मगाशी बोलून.
Okay, ठीक है, yes, okay. So anyone have question? Krishnamurti ji, our Hindu temples are destroyed by Mughal invaders and now preserved by heritage. How can we restore these Hindu temples?
Okay, this cannot be really answered in one sentence, because each temple is different. Like I said, the value and significance and historical importance of that particular temple will actually decide or help us identify what should be the process of restoration and all. Perhaps we can look one or two cases in the next few session. Maybe one or two cases will help you to understand that. It's not something that I can answer in one sentence. Like I said,
It's
the
okay. After
intact
our
will
examples,
take care of.
they can understand it.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So there are no any other questions. So with kind permission, Sindhuji, can we conclude this today's session?
Sure, sir. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
all.
Yeah, thanks a lot to all of you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jay.
धन्यवाद.